is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 8:01 on LBC. I'm Iain Dale. Welcome to Monday's edition of Cross Question. Quite a lot to talk about today, isn't there? Not least with our panel with Nick Thomas-Symonds, who's Shadow International Trade Secretary and Labour MP for Torvine. Ella Robertson McKay is Chair of Conservative Young Women and Managing Director of One Young World. Andrew Fisher is author of Labour's 2017 manifesto and the party's Executive Director of Policy under Jeremy Corbyn. And Ben Kentish is LBC's Westminster Editor. They are all geared up to answer your calls and your texts. 0345 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850. And don't forget, you can watch us on Global Player. And I've been told, I didn't know this, you can actually link Global Player to your television. So you can actually watch us on television if you want to. That's why, don't ask me how to do it, but apparently it's really easy.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first question. It's from Ben in Clacton. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Iain, and good evening, panel. The question is, Keir Starmer said today he would resign if he was found to break the law. And I just want to know if this would restore the public's faith in Parliament. It would go some way to restoring the public's faith in Parliament when this happens.
Andrew Fisher.
I think it's a good move by Keir Starmer, but I don't think it will restore faith in Parliament because I think Boris Johnson clearly isn't going to resign, and he already has been investigated and found guilty and found to have broken the law and fined. And there are, I believe, 12 other parties that are still being investigated by the Met, so there could be more of this. And he's clearly not going to budge. He would have done by now if he was going to. So,
but
no, but it's good for Keir Starmer. I think it's the right thing to do for him.
If Keir Starmer did resign, if he was issued with a fixed penalty notice, do you not think that there would be an incredible amount of pressure on Boris Johnson to go in those circumstances, not least maybe from Tory MPs?
I think there possibly would be. It would increase, certainly. But we've said this before about Boris Johnson. He's the first Prime Minister, I think, in British history to have been found to have broken the law while in office, and that hasn't budged him. So, somebody else showing they've got integrity, I'm not sure is going to make Boris Johnson suddenly develop some 50 years into his political career.
The greased piglet, as David Cameron once called him.
I don't want to speak about David Cameron and greased piglets, to be honest, Iain.
Ella.
Well, putting that aside, I think Keir Starmer had to find a narrow tightrope to walk on this issue, right? He actually said that the point that Boris Johnson was investigated by the police, that Boris Johnson should go at that point. So I think the only thing that the public hate more than a lying politician is a hypocritical one. And I think he had to find some kind of balance, which he struck today. Whether or not what the consequences of that are, we can't play out right now. I think it would increase pressure amongst Tory MPs to potentially take action collectively, but I don't think it would change the decision from number 10 at the moment.
Nick?
Well, I hope that it will go some way to restoring trust, particularly to show that not all politicians are the same. And I think what we saw today was a person of integrity, somebody to whom the law, the rule of law, doing the right thing is enormously important. And that is exactly the Keir that I saw today giving that speech, saying that if he does receive a fixed penalty notice, he will resign. Now, what a contrast that is to the way the Prime Minister has behaved for month after month after month. Already had a fixed penalty notice. The Metropolitan Police investigation is ongoing. The Sue Gray investigation is ongoing. Has repeatedly lied to Parliament and dragged politics into the gutter. What Keir has done today is absolutely the right thing, and I hope it will go some way to restoring that trust.
Why wait till Monday, though? When the police announced they were doing this on Friday, he could have done this at any point between Friday and today. Was this not a case of him sitting down with his advisors and taking the most expedient line possible?
It's not expedient to put your job on the line for a particular principle. It's a huge decision to take. Now, I do not believe for a minute, that Keir Starmer has broken the law. This is Keir who self-isolated, you'll recall, Iain, 6 times during the pandemic, always studiously following the rules. So I don't believe for a moment that in respect of this evening in County Durham he broke the rules. But nonetheless, it is such an important and fundamental principle to strike that those who are breaking the very laws that they made shouldn't remain in post.
Well, of course, if he was completely consistent, though, he would have already resigned, wouldn't he? Because back in January, he and Angela Rayner both said that Boris Johnson should resign because he was being investigated by the police. Not because he was found guilty, just because he was being investigated. You've got to admit that, on the face of it, does sound a little hypocritical.
Well, no, because the context was very different. That they called for the resignation in January at that point, but already at that point, Allegra Stratton had gone in the December, some weeks before. In addition to that, we'd already had the repeated lying to Parliament. And by that point, first of all, we already knew there had been, let's be frank about it, industrial level law breaking going on. I mean, is there another place of employment in Britain with as much law breaking in the pandemic?
It still doesn't answer my point.
No, but it does answer the point, Iain, in this sense.
How does Allegra Stratton resign? How does that have any impact on what Keir Starmer said that Boris Johnson should do at the point that it was announced that he was being investigated?
Because at that point, it was already clear there had been industrial-scale partying and industrial-scale breaking of the rules. It was already clear, and indeed that is precisely what was then confirmed with the 50 so far fixed penalty notices that have been set out. And somebody in number 10 had already resigned. I mean, Boris Johnson was there at the dispatch box saying that, yes, he was very sad that Allegra Stratton had gone, but this was the right thing to do, and then not applying the same standard himself some weeks later.
Ben Kentish, do you think that, as Ben asks, that Keir Starmer saying he'll resign actually restores people's faith in politics a bit?
Not one bit, Iain. Let's answer Ben's question directly. Trust in politics is at an incredibly worrying low. And frankly, I'd like politicians of all stripes to spend a little bit more time than I think many of them do thinking about what that might be and how all of them as a political class can start to turn that around. Because from my perspective, it's only getting worse. I think if Keir Starmer had at the forefront of his mind, he would have come out on Friday straight away and said, of course, what he said today, I will resign if I'm fined. That said, I do think it's to some extent to his credit that he's done so today. I think for 2 reasons. Firstly, there have to be consequences for poor behaviour by politicians, particularly something like law breaking. Secondly, that the political reason, I don't buy the idea, Ian, this is such a big risk, a huge gamble that he's taken. I don't think it is. I think if he'd been fined, regardless of what he said today, he would be out of his job. He would be toast because of what he said about Boris Johnson. In that context, what he said today made sense because regardless, if he was fined, he's gone anyway. So he might as well try, gamble on the fact that he won't get fined and try and turn the fire back on Boris Johnson. And I think he's done that today. Look, let's be clear. Whatever he does, even if he does go, Boris Johnson will not resign over this. I think it's unlikely at this stage that Tory MPs will force him out over this. But what Starmer's trying to do, and this is sort of up in the air, is draw a very clear line of distinction between how he's responded to this today and how Boris Johnson did when he was fined. And it will be for voters to decide whether they buy that or whether they think, as you suggested, that it could be simply a political device.
One of the things that voters often complain about is they say, well, you're all the same. Well, this is a very good example of them not being the same.
Actually, I mean, I think one of the things that's been brought up is the matter of truthfulness. So we had this very, very long story from various people in Labour that they were all working very late and they got hungry and they ordered a curry and a beer emerged and then they went back to work afterwards. And we've seen a memo of the agenda of that visit, which had a pre-planned curry order on it. At some point late, someone was going to order a curry and they were going to have a meal together. Now, that's not to say that that's the worst thing that anyone's ever done, but it is a very, very different story from the one that they'd said before. Then there was Angela Rayner. Was she there? Wasn't she there? I mean, this principle of truthfulness isn't particularly present on the Labour side either, and I think everyone's just quite disappointed.
And Nick, that's the problem, isn't it? Because the police say that there's new evidence, which is presumably either that Angela Rayner was there when they said she wasn't, and also the fact that Keir Starmer has said on multiple occasions, well, sort of had some dinner, and then we went back to work. And they clearly didn't go back to work. There's witnesses in the papers who were there who said, no, we didn't actually afterwards.
No, I don't think that's the case at all. And in fact, the document, which is what we call an ops note, an operations note, I'm sure Andrew will be very familiar with these and seen many of them from his previous role. And they're very, very important documents because they construct the structure of particular visits. But that document, far from proving inconsistency, does the opposite. It actually shows that this was part of the working day. And what Keir has always said about it is that, yes, it's a work event, which was an exception in the rules at that time, that they were working. I think it was a takeaway that was available in the kitchen, and they continued working.
How is that any different to Rishi Sunak turning up to a work meeting, or what he thought was a work meeting, wandering into the cabinet room for this meeting and finding people there wishing Boris Johnson a happy birthday, staying for 2 minutes, and he's got fined for that? How is that different to that?
Well, my understanding of that particular case, there was a line drawn. There are some, I think it's the one on the 15th of May, is my recollection, 2020, where the Met have decided not to investigate number 10. I think it's the picture of the garden where they're at work and there is, I think it's cheese and wine on the tables. Now, the Met have decided not to investigate that because it is, part of the working day. So I do think there is a consistency. I mean, in terms of the Chancellor, I'm not sure precisely what he said in the questionnaire that he was evidently sent to be able to comment on precisely how that's happened. But there is a line that's been drawn in the Met investigation with the ones they've chosen not to investigate.
Ben, people like to think, well, what happens in the worst case scenario? And the worst case scenario here is that Keir Starmer goes. And then, of course, the Labour Party leadership election rules, I mean, it takes quite a long time to elect in fact, in both parties. What would happen then?
There would have to be an interim leader, probably a senior member of the shadow cabinet, and maybe Nick Thomas-Symonds might be interested. And then there would be I think probably quite a quick as they could realistically do it, leadership contest in which all sorts of people, Lisa Nandy, Wes Streeting, others David Lammy potentially could throw their hat in the ring. But they would need to get that done as quick as possible because the last thing they want is this sort of vacuum, letting the Conservatives dominate the narrative for months on end, which has happened previously. They'd need to get it done quickly, but they're already, I think, people will be thinking and talking in Westminster. They have been today, about who some of the potential successors might be.
Does that make you salivate, the prospect of a leadership election, Andrew, or do you view it with horror?
I don't think it will come to that anyway. I don't think Keir Starmer probably will be in breach. I think the other thing we haven't discussed is that what happened in Durham was under Tier 2 restrictions, which were more lax, whereas the Downing Street parties in the main certainly were under full lockdown, where the rules were much tighter, and therefore the breach of them is far more egregious. And I suspect there won't be, and I very much doubt Keir Starmer would have made the statement he did previously if he thought he was, let alone the statement today, but the statements he's made previously, if he thought there was any doubt that he had broken the law. So I don't think it will come to that. I mean, if it does, then yes, he said he'd go, and Lorena, who would normally step up to be the leader in the interim, would go, and then it would be a fairly open field.
Has she said anything today?
She has said she would resign as well.
She has, right. Okay,
if she was there, if she's found to have broken the law.
Right, keep your calls coming. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask our panel a question. It's coming up to 8:15.
This is LBC. Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
16 minutes past 8 on Cross Question. We have Nick Thomas-Symonds with us, Ella Robertson McKay, Chair of Conservative Young Women and Managing Director of One Young World. What is One Young World?
It is an apolitical organisation that I am not here to discuss, Ian.
Oh. Sorry I mentioned it.
No, I'm very delighted that you mentioned it. It's a wonderful charity, but I'm here with my Conservative hat
OK,
on.
fine. Andrew Fisher is quite happy to talk about anything political. And Ben Kentish, that's his job. He's LBC's Westminster editor. A text question from Mary in Enfield. We've heard more than 2 million people in the UK can't afford to eat in the UK. Can you ask the panel how much shame they feel when they hear that? Ben Kentish.
A great deal of shame. I think it's absolutely appalling. We heard today 1 in 7 households have had to cut back on food or skip meals. That's up 57% since January. 7.3 million adults and more than 2.5 million children, Ian, living in homes where people have had to go without food. This is Britain in 2022. Now, clearly there are short-term causes of this. The inflation that we are seeing this year is very worrying. I think the government is now accepting it needs to do more and will do more quite soon. But fundamentally, what's being exposed here are structural and underlying issues that have been not addressed by consecutive governments of both main parties for decades when it comes to poverty and inequality and productivity in the economy. We've had a lack of growth in recent years. And I think anybody living in this country, regardless of your political persuasion, regardless of what you think about the two main parties or the other parties now, should feel a deep sense of shame and a deep sense of worry that in this country, the 5th biggest economy in the world, in the 21st century, there are people struggling to eat and struggling to heat. And we've heard, haven't we, on LBC, pensioners sitting on buses driving around because that's the only way they can keep warm. A deep sense of shame is something I think I certainly feel, and I think everyone, frankly, should.
Ella?
Yeah, it makes me feel sick. And it's not just people who really are living in deep poverty. These are people of a variety of incomes where suddenly the cost of living has absolutely crept up and knocked them to their knees in recent weeks.
But you support the government that's allowed this to happen?
It's not just the Conservative government that's allowed it to happen. I think regardless of whichever government was in power, there's a whole range of external factors which have contributed to the cost of living crisis. And quite frankly, we're seeing zero solutions from the Labour benches at the moment as to how we would address that. I think it says a lot about Britain that when it really mattered during the pandemic, we really looked after vulnerable people. And I think that there is the possibility in our country to do that. And it does worry me that this has been allowed to creep up and happen. I think it's really, really concerning, and it's happening on so many different fronts, whether it's energy, whether it's food, whether it's something that people feel is completely out of their control. But at the same time, the government's got this terrible balance to strike, whereas if we borrow too much, inflation's going to go up even more and worsen the problem. And it's a very, very complex situation.
But the least the government could do in these circumstances is actually show that it understood the problem and empathised with the problem. But we've had successive government ministers, Boris Johnson, George Eustice, Jacob Rees-Mogg, just seeming to be oblivious to the fact that people are in this plight. I
think I can only imagine it must be difficult when you are those politicians who are in the driving seat and you're really having to deal with the questions about it all the time. I can imagine that sometimes you might not come across as compassionate as you might feel. But I think that's really what voters and people who are involved with the voluntary sector of parties and civil society, that's what they want to see right now, is they want to see more compassion from politicians so that they feel at least that they're being understood, even if these intractable issues are very hard to address.
Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Well, the government did something that I regard as one of the most callous things a government has done, and actually put through the largest cut in the welfare state since 1945, the largest overnight cut. And here we are now, months later.
You're talking about the universal credit cut. But I mean, that was a temporary uplift, wasn't it? And it was always understood to be that.
But the government should have understood what the consequences would be of carrying out that cut at the time that they did. And it's just one example of why decisions that governments do make an enormous difference. And those figures should shame us all. What's over 7 million people going without a meal because they have actually had to consider they don't have the money to afford it. Over 2 million children included in that who are living in poverty. These are shameful statistics, and they come about because of a record, frankly, of 12 years of failure. And what we have to do is to not just understand the scale of the problem, but to actually look at how we have solutions for it. I've argued previously on your show about a windfall tax, Iain. I've said that...
That seems to be your only solution.
Hang on. That the wrong decision from the Chancellor to prevent the excess profits of the oil and gas companies that are, by the way, making record profits every quarter, help the poorest households with up to £600 in help for their energy bills. We've spoken about a cut particularly with VAT on energy bills. We have pledged to invest
that doesn't work, does it? That doesn't work because I will get 5% off my energy bills. You'll get 5% off yours. Whereas surely that money, if you've got the money available to help people, direct it at the people who need it most, not people like you and me.
That's why we've combined that proposal with that targeting that allows up to £600.
Yeah, but if you did proper targeting, you could add. I don't know what 5% cut would cost, but you could then add that into the mix to give people who really need it what they need.
We've put the two measures together, so there is targeting. But in addition to that, we've pledged each and every year to invest £28 billion, our climate investment pledge, which will go towards things like insulating 19 million homes. I don't understand why that just isn't being done. That's one of those things that would create jobs and would help people with their energy bills, that would actually look at creating the green jobs of the future. So we are putting those proposals forward. It's time the government listened.
Andrew Fisher.
It doesn't just shame me. I've got a real sort of impending sense of terror because this is going to get worse. This isn't it. This is going to keep getting worse. We've seen the Bank of England saying inflation's going to hit 10%. They've said unemployment's going to hit 5.5%. So, and then energy bills are going to go up by another £600 or £700 in October, we're told, because they're going to allow the price cap to go up. So this is going to get far, far worse. This is the tip of the iceberg. This is the beginning of this crisis. And if it's already like that at the beginning, what on earth is it going to be like at the end? So there are lots of things we can do. I don't believe this is some intractable problem, apart from my inability to say the word intractable. I think there are solutions. I think one is, look at what France has done. It owns its own energy, and it said, you're going to cap your rises at 4% this year. You're going to take the hit. Your shareholders are going to take the hit. And that's a similar variation on what a windfall tax would do. It's taking the profits and giving them somewhere else.
It's publicly owned. It doesn't have shareholders, does it?
No, but it's the equivalent thing. It's the same effect. You're basically reducing the cost of the energy. So you can do that. You can have price controls or a windfall tax that then redistributes. Those are good things. The Mayor of London today has called for rent controls in London, a rent freeze across London. That's exactly right. Lots of cities around the world, from Berlin to New York, have some sort of rent control. We don't. It was all abolished when Thatcher got rid of fair rent tribunals in 1989. So, that could be brought in. That's possible. Lots of other countries do it. And I think that's necessary, because otherwise we're going to have a debt and homelessness crisis. We should inflation-proof wages, benefits and pensions. The government scrapped the triple lock this year. They all ran on a manifesto pledge. Labour did, the Tories did, and the government scrapped the triple lock this year. So pensions have gone up by 3% when inflation's going up by 10%. That's going to put a lot more pensioners in poverty. Why has that happened? It could have gone up by 10%. Social benefits.
Well, it could, but I think, to be fair, nobody realised inflation was going to run away.
We had a spring statement just, a month ago?
No, I agree.
And they could have changed it.
They could have changed it then, but at the time, when they abolished that part of the triple lock, I don't think anybody envisaged that inflation
You've had
would
6
run
months.
Like
they abolished that in September or October last year, Ian. They've had 6 months to act, and they've sat on their hands.
Point.
And that, I think, is the biggest thing that we haven't talked about, really, in relation to the local election results, because when I was out canvassing, what was coming up wasn't Partygate that much. It did come up at a couple of doors. But actually, it was I'm struggling to pay my bills. The cost of living is by far the biggest thing. My council tax has gone up. My rent's going up. Those were the things that people were talking about on the doorstep. And actually, the government has sat idly by and allowed all of this to happen and has got no solutions. I mean, you can criticise Nick and the windfall tax and say, well, that's not enough and that's not there. But at least they've got a policy that would actually help. Might not be enough, but it would help.
Right. Thank you, Mary, for your question. Let's move on to Phil in Broadstairs. Phil, what's your question, please?
My question is, Ian, thank you very much for taking the call. My question is that the question of how the police look back on various offences or not. Now, with Dominic Cummings, they claimed they couldn't look back, the Durham police, and he kind of slipped out the back door. Yet with Keir Starmer, they've discovered they can look back. Now, a number of people signed a petition to get Cummings to be brought to some sort of book on this. Nothing happened. He resigned. But I just wondered whether we feel this is a fair way for the Durham police to be operating. It seems like they're making it up as they go along.
Well, there does seem to be an inconsistency there. And of course, the Met said the same thing back in December, that they weren't going to investigate the Downing Street parties. And then a month later, they did. Does this undermine further, and going back to our first question in a way, Ben Kentish, does it undermine further public trust, not just in politics, but also the police? Because I think there are some people who believe that the police are being influenced on these things, either by politicians or by newspapers.
I think there's 2 points, slightly separate points there. In the first, the policing of this has been wildly inconsistent. I remember the first lockdown, you had that couple that had gone to walk their dog in the Peak District, and this was seen as the worst possible thing. You had police social media accounts saying, don't you dare do this. And then on the other hand, you have things like Dominic Cummings, who drove 250 miles, no further action taken. So there have been, and we've had people fined thousands and thousands of pounds for attending parties, and others getting off scot-free, and so on. So it's a difficult job. They are policing laws that none of us ever thought we'd see in our lifetime and hoped we wouldn't. So it is tricky, but I do think there's been a huge degree of inconsistency in how it's been enforced. The second thing to say, really, is what was your direct question, Iain?
Well, the question
about the politicisation of policing. Yeah. Yes. Politicians should not be telling or asking police what they think they should do. Now, let's be clear. We're a long way from Putin's Russia, where a government person picks up the phone to the police and they do their bidding. But I think this trend that we've seen in recent months, and it's happened on both sides, of elected officials very publicly, even on Twitter, tagging certain police forces, telling them what they think they should do, is a trend that should worry us all. I do not like it. I don't think politicians should be lobbying the police in any way. And of course, the police will say they act without fear or favour. But if you've got senior politicians on both sides of the spectrum putting pressure on you to investigate certain things or not investigate certain things, that will have an impact. And it's an impact that I don't think is a good one for our democracy.
Ella.
I think that clearly the police should not show any favour to individual politicians, but I actually think that your point about the involvement of politicians in police is, I would disagree with you there. I think actually we've seen some absolutely abhorrent behaviour in the police, for example, within the Met when it comes to misogyny, when it came to the policing of Sarah Everard's vigil, when it came to the misogynist and racist WhatsApp groups at Charing Cross Police Station. And Cressida Dick's defence was, the politicians are getting far too involved with the way that the Met Police is run. And it's completely wrong. The police should be accountable, and the problem is that they haven't been. So it has to be that politicians from across the political spectrum...
Yeah, but that's totally different.
It is, but I think the point about should the politicians be calling out actions of the police or not? They absolutely should when the police behave badly.
There's fundamentally different between saying they got the policing of this protest wrong, which I think most people would agree they did, and actively saying, you need to investigate this. Why aren't you investigating this? In a way that is clearly party political. And as I say, all sides have done it. But I think there's a fundamental difference between criticising how a protest was policed, say, and actively putting pressure on them to investigate.
The reason why I bring it up, because I appreciate there are different issues, but when Cressida Dick left office, her parting shot was basically, I really regret the involvement of politicians in the police force. And I'm actually I'm concerned that the police aren't policed enough, actually. And I do think that, particularly when it comes to issues of women's safety, of race, of dignity of treatment, I would rather the politicians got more involved rather than less involved.
Andrew.
I completely agree with that point. I was going to make it myself, but you did it very articulately. So on the substance of this, I agree, really. I mean, I haven't really got a lot to add, I don't think.
Well, that's quite good, because we're coming up to the news.
Well, perfect. I think there is an inconsistency, and why aren't they looking back at Dominic Cummings? That does seem to me the logical thing to do in this scenario.
I don't think there have been many Tories disagree with you on that.
There is one important point, but the Met Police were taken to court in order to do this. It was actually under legal threat that they then started the investigation. I think it was the public interest lawyers, or whatever they're called, that group, the Good Law Project, that's them, who took the Met to court.
Don't mention them on this programme.
Oh, sorry.
Nick.
I think, look, the police have to have operational independence. They have to be able to make decisions on the basis of the evidence that's before them. That's absolutely right. But more broadly, of course, we have to hold our police to account for the highest standards. Absolutely, that's the role of politicians to do. And secondly, there is, I think, a distinction to be drawn, because as a constituency member of Parliament, I will have constituents coming to me complaining about antisocial behaviour in a particular area, complaining I've got, an issue at the moment where I'm in dialogue with my local police about the illegal use of off-road bikes that spot it. So raising issues that are a priority of constituents with police, I think, is actually essential to be able to do that. So I think we've got to just make that distinction between what's operational and what is holding to account and actually funding in the views of the public.
Interesting, The Guardian are just reporting that they have seen a document which gives evidence that Keir Starmer was working past 1 a.m. on the morning in question after that party, and that's going to be submitted to the police. They've compiled time-stamped logs of WhatsApp chats, documents and video edits. So that's an interesting development. I just wonder whether it's wise to necessarily reveal that in advance of the investigation. But anyway, that's the latest on so-called Beergate. It's 8:32 on LBC. Let's get the latest news headlines from Serena Farrow.
Sir Keir Starmer says he's committed to doing what he calls the right thing and will step down as Labour leader if he's fined for breaking lockdown rules. He insists no laws were broken, though, when he attended an event in April last year in Durham. The Queen is going to miss out on tomorrow's state opening of Parliament. Buckingham Palace says Prince Charles will read the speech on her behalf. The government's policies and proposed laws for the new session are expected to be laid out. And the Chancellor's hinted that more help could be on the way for families struggling with the rising cost of living. A charity has warned around 2 million adults in the UK are skipping meals because they can't afford to eat. LBC weather, rain continuing southeastwards tonight, easing though later on. Mild in the south but cooler in the north with a low of 6 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:35 on LBC. On our panel, Nick Thomas-Symonds, the Shadow International Trade Secretary, Ella Robertson McKay, Chair of Conservative Young Women, and Andrew Fisher was the Labour Party's Executive Director of Policy under Jeremy Corbyn, and Ben Kentish is LBC's Westminster Editor. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. And of course, remember, you can watch us on Global Player. Peter in Kingsbury has texted in on 84850. He says Putin showed no sign of rowing back today in his terrifying speech. If he won't give up and we won't give up, how does it end? Nick?
It has to end on the basis of the consent of President Zelensky speaking for the people of Ukraine, because how many times in the past have we had this where so-called greater powers settle issues for so-called lesser powers? Where this ends has to be in what President Zelensky judges to be the outcome. But at the same time, we have to be absolutely clear in our criticism. It's been an appalling illegal invasion. And whilst we had a lot of coverage, didn't we, day to day, when there was the two-pronged attack going on, if you like, the one-pronged attack at Kyiv, the other part in the Donbass at Donetsk and Luhansk. But whilst we perhaps haven't got the same level of coverage, be in no doubt about the atrocities that are continuing in eastern Ukraine.
So you reckon that this could last months, years?
It worries me. It worries me deeply that it could continue. It certainly does. I don't think anyone would be so foolish as to simply assume there's some sort of end date. And the suffering, I'm afraid, of the Ukrainian people is continuing. We must do all we can to stand beside them.
Andrew Fisher, does it end when it is finally clear to Vladimir Putin that his supply lines aren't working, that his logistical supplies aren't working, that his equipment isn't working, and his soldiers are in open revolt, which we read that some of them actually are? I mean, because it's easy to think that this could be a stalemate for years and years and years, but there are positive signs, aren't there?
I think one of the positive signs was right at the beginning where, and I criticised the British government for dragging its feet on this, although it did get there in the end. But the European Union, the US and the UK and others put big economic sanctions and meaningful economic sanctions on Russia. They're intensifying, and obviously European countries that are more reliant on Russian oil have got to find replacements for that. So there's got to be a timeline on this, but hopefully that can still ratchet up a bit further. I think that will put pressure on him, and hopefully for the Russian people themselves, this leads to the downfall of Vladimir Putin. That would be my favoured way that it ends, is that he is either deposed in some sort of internal palace coup, but he's a dictator. He's got complete control of the Russian state, and unless there is some sort of uprising like that a group of people within his coterie think this is damaging our economy too much, let's just get rid of him, I can't see how it ends actually in the short term. But as I say, I think this idea of putting these sanctions on and ratcheting them up a lot further is a very good idea. I hope actually that in future, when we're dealing with dictators that invade other countries illegally, we do the same thing and we apply these standards universally, not just because it's on Europe's doorstep, because Saudi Arabia is causing the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, according to the Red Cross, in Yemen, and has been for 5 years. And the Labour Party's called for arms embargo for at least 5 years. That goes back, across different political opinions. Hilary Benn was the Shadow Foreign Secretary, I think, when we put that on the table. So this isn't the only atrocity going on in the world. These aren't the only things going on in the world, and we have to be consistent about this. But I hope that there will be this ratcheting up, and I hope that, for the Russian people's sake as well, that he is deposed.
Ella.
I think that's absolutely right. Ratcheting up of more aggressive sanctions, more targeted sanctions on people close to Putin. But also, I think, looking at the broader international framework of making it unacceptable for other countries to be trading with Russia, to be doing business with Russia, to increase Russia's isolation. I think that's incredibly important. I think we've also got to be making sure that we're getting better arms to the Ukrainians, and we've got to be pushing our European allies to be doing more. Too many arms shipments are getting held up by France and Germany for no reason at all. And I think we've got to show consistent strength. I also think that we've got to make sure that China sees interest for her, that it's better to be working with us, with Europe and with the United States than with an increasingly weak and useless ally in Putin. But I think that it's a moment for continued strength, because any weakness on our part is going to embolden Putin. But I think the most important thing is that we continue to work with international institutions like the ICC and the ICJ in The Hague to make sure that there is accountability in the end. For example, on things like sexual violence, it's not just Putin that needs to be held accountable. We need to be holding the individuals who are committing war crimes on the ground against Ukrainian men, women and children. There needs to be accountability for them in the end.
Ben?
Well, I think Ella's spot on. We can all hope that this ends with Vladimir Putin and his generals on trial for war crimes at The Hague. In the short to medium term, I fear Nick is also right to say this is going to become a war of attrition in the Donbass. It's a war that Putin absolutely cannot afford to lose. I think he will get increasingly desperate, and that's something that should worry us too. I think it either ends effectively with Putin being ousted by those around him, or with Russia, unfortunately, taking the Donbass. But even that, if that does happen, of course, we all hope it won't, would be, and I think, very much a Pyrrhic victory for the reasons that Ella and Andrew have said. Whatever happens in Ukraine, their incredible heroism, the response of the West, means that this has already been a catastrophic failure for Vladimir Putin. He's driven some of the Scandinavian countries into the open arms of NATO. It looks like the Russian economy is already starting to crumble. As Ella says, I think it's driven a wedge already between Moscow and Beijing. It is a catastrophic blunder by him. And even if eastern Ukraine is ultimately taken in Russian, I think this will go down in history as one of the, not just the most horrific events of the early 21st century, or the 21st century as a whole, but also one of the most reckless and stupid. I do also just want to, I think it's worth saying that Nick's right to say there's another risk here, and that is the longer this goes on, the more people frankly get outrage, fatigue, the eyes turn away, the media coverage ends.
I think that's already started.
And some of those atrocities, we saw it happen in Syria, and some of the atrocities that we've seen in recent weeks go less noticed than they have now, and I think that's something that's worth just being aware of.
I think you're absolutely right, and I'm very conscious presenting this programme that we need to keep our eyes on what's going on in Ukraine, because there was a time when every single night we'd be spending at least 1 hour of the programme on it. That's less so now, but I shall try and ensure that we give it the coverage that it deserves in the future. Right, let's go to Brad in Nottingham. Hello, Brad.
Hi, Ian. Thanks for taking my question. The Queen is staying away due to mobility reasons. Should she be showing some vulnerability, as many of the public struggle with mobility themselves?
Ella?
I wouldn't deign to tell the Queen what to do, but I can see it's not just about mobility issues. She might be unwell. I think that we should all be very clear that if the Queen were to come out in a wheelchair or with a Zimmer frame, I think the public would be just as proud to see her and support her. And I hope that she would feel that she was able to do that. But I can see why, sitting through the Queen's speech, which is pretty lengthy, that she might not feel that quite up to it. That seems like a pretty lengthy, long engagement for a lady in her 90s to be undertaking.
Andrew?
I think I agree. I mean, if she's...
You two agree an awful lot.
Well,
That's a bit worrying.
Sorry. I'm sure you can find a way to divide us later, Ian. But, look, she's 96 years old. There's a lot of pageantry that goes with this thing. It's not just sitting in a throne and reading a speech for, 5 or 10 minutes. There's a whole procession that goes with it. She has to be dressed in a certain way. I don't know if it's purely a mobility issue. I totally agree. If she was in a wheelchair or a Zimmer frame, or, even if she had to do it through Zoom, I don't see why we can't do that. There are other ways. But look, Prince Charles can come and do this. It's a bit of old traditional British pantomime, and there's a replacement, there's a stand-in, an understudy, if you like. And, good for Prince Charles, he gets a go, and hopefully she gets a rest and feels better.
I got my stand-in here.
Me? Don't look at me.
If I can't get tonight, you take over.
No one wants to hear that, Ian.
I don't know.
I mean, the first thing to say is obviously I think everyone's concern is about her health. But I think there's something in the question, which is the Queen is, she's an absolute icon of sort of resoluteness and dignity and quiet courage. I think if she came out now, and Buckingham Palace has always been very clear not to give too much away. They don't want to talk about any frailties or vulnerabilities or so on. I think with the Queen, after so long on the throne, that's probably going to be the case now, while for the rest of her life. But I do think there's a shift in the next generation, and particularly William and, dare I say, Harry too. There's much more of a willingness and, in fact, a determination to talk a bit more openly about things like mental health. And I think that's important, Ian, because these issues are issues that face people across the country, face all of us in various ways at some point in our lives. And to have the royal family, to have the person on the throne showing some degree of vulnerability, as I said, I don't think we'll see it anytime necessarily soon, probably not with Prince Charles either. But the younger members of the royal family are more just more able, I think, and more comfortable speaking in that way. And I think that's a good thing.
I think you're absolutely right. People from an older generation are not used to displaying any sign of vulnerability. And I think as the head of state, I think that's probably an added weight. I think my mother had like 5 hip replacements and 2 knee replacements. She would not be seen in public with a walking stick.
It's that stiff upper lip.
Absolutely right.
But that reminds me of my late grandmother, actually, who inspired me to come into politics, who had that same issue, that she refused to be seen in public with a walking stick, just wouldn't do it. I mean, look, 2 points. I think, firstly, I think, of course, we should respect the Queen's decision. I mean, she's 96. She's given us 70 years of service. I think we respect the judgment that she's made. And as Andrew says, we have Prince Charles coming to fill in any event. But on the broader point about public figures showing vulnerability, absolutely, that's a good thing. And I do think that is something where there's been generational change.
Tony Blair wouldn't even wear his glasses to read a speech. There was always a real faff about that.
He did in the end.
But it was a very long time where he did need them. And I think, the idea that someone would be worried about wearing glasses now just seems of a completely different era.
I think, Ian, it's also worth saying that change has come about because of specific individuals. And in politics, it's people like Charles Walker, it's people like Jamie Wallace speaking very openly about the difficulties they face, and it's to their credit. And the royal family have the people who have spoken about it too, sports and so on. It's to their credit that things are starting to change in the way that makes sense.
She's got to appear on the balcony though on the Jubilee weekend, hasn't she? I mean, that's just a given. It's 8:47.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Weekday mornings from 7.
Andy Haldane in the studio. He served as Chief Economist at the Bank of England until June of last year. Chief Executive of the Royal Society of Arts. We learnt last week inflation could hit 10% or over by the end of this year. Are we already in recession?
I'm not sure we're quite there at the moment, but what it plainly is very anemic levels of economic growth and many people really feeling the pinch.
Will we go into recession?
I think it's a better than evens chance.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
10 to 9 on LBC. We're going to be talking about what's happening in Northern Ireland after 9 o'clock, but we've now got a question on Northern Ireland from Bill in Ashton, who says, does the political chaos in Northern Ireland prove once and for all that Brexit was a mistake? Well, Nick, you has got an interest in this, given your current job.
Well, I think whether something is a mistake depends upon how those in government actually deal with it. And I'm afraid that Boris Johnson openly lied to the people of Northern Ireland as to what the consequences of the agreement that he negotiated was. That's one of the fundamental issues that we face. But our focus now, we've seen the results in Northern Ireland. We've seen Sinn Féin have topped the poll. That is significant. Nobody can deny that's the case. But the institutions that were created by the Good Friday Agreement were designed so that both sides of the community would have a say in the government. That's the structure that's been created with the minister and indeed the Deputy First Minister. So unionism will still have an extremely strong voice within the Northern Ireland Assembly. And
it's actually got a majority of members in the Northern Ireland Assembly, I think I'm right in saying.
Yes, I think...
They're split,
They're split, precisely. So what I think there needs to be now is a relentless focus on getting the executive back up and running with both sides of the community, and indeed the Alliance Party, by the way, which did win a significant number of seats, all able to have that vote.
Let me just correct myself, because I think it's not a majority of seats in the Assembly, but they've got more seats than the Nationalist parties put together. I think that's
right. I think that probably is correct.
Yeah. And Ben Kentish, this threatens to be a real problem for the government, doesn't it? I mean, Brandon Lewis, the Northern Ireland Secretary, he's obviously urging the DUP to nominate a Deputy First Minister. They're saying no, not until you change the protocol.
Absolutely, and it's going to be one of the issues that's going to dominate the next few months, the next few years, because, of course, if Sinn Féin do end up as the First Minister leading the executive, as Nick says, of course, it's always the system is designed to have balance, but I think it's probably fair to say the prospect of a border poll is closer than it's been at any time in a generation. Then you have the SNP, of course, pushing very hard for an independence referendum in Scotland. The very future of the United Kingdom in its current form is at play here. That will worry the government too, but in the short term, there's a big decision to be made, a huge decision about what happens to the Northern Ireland Protocol, which sounds very technical and boring, and in some ways it is, but the government is considering completely ripping up the agreement that was made with Brussels just 2 years or so ago. They say it's not working. Others say, and I think there's something in this, well, it was obvious what was going to happen. You signed the thing. If they do that, Brussels will go absolutely ballistic. But the bigger worry to people in Whitehall and Number 10 is what Joe Biden and the US government will do. And at a time when, as Nick will know much better than me, the UK is trying very, very hard to agree a trade deal with the US, infuriating the administration in Washington by tearing up an international agreement is an enormous risk for the UK government, and one that even some in Cabinet, I hear, don't want Boris Johnson to take.
Andrew?
I think it's... it's an historic moment, that Sinn Féin have topped the poll, the Republican Party is now leading in Northern Ireland. The whole system of, the whole structure of Northern Ireland was set up to prevent that being the case. But
it's almost they only got 1% more than they got last time. It is because of the collapse of the DUP.
But there's a reason for that, and this is what's causing, if you like, the political chaos. It's the DUP played a sort of tactical game against Theresa May. It didn't like her deal, which would have protected, actually, Northern Ireland's trade a lot more, the deal she had negotiated. They were promised by Boris Johnson. He went across to their conference in Northern Ireland and said, I'll be with you, I'll stand against, Theresa May's deal, I'll get something even better. And then he stabbed them in the back to get a deal through Parliament. And so now they're going to play hardball with this government, and quite rightly. They've been done over by him, frankly, duped by him.
Get that DUPED.
I didn't even intend that part, but there we are. You can claim that. Well done for noticing it. But they are going to use their political capital that they've got, which is the fact that they can withdraw their support effectively from the institution, because they don't have to nominate. Well, they should nominate ministers, but they're going to not do that in order to try and get this sorted. But But the problem for this is that this does need to be sorted for the people of Northern Ireland, not for the DUP, not for Brandon Lewis or Boris Johnson. This is really affecting the economy of Northern Ireland, and it was a bad deal. We said that at the time. I remember saying it in 2019 when they negotiated it, that this was a problem. But of course, Northern Ireland politics doesn't often matter in Westminster, except when it really does force itself on the agenda. And unfortunately, this went through without enough scrutiny, either in Westminster or in the media as well. And we are where we are. But I think it's quite a significant... I wouldn't want to miss the significance either of the Alliance Party, that sort of third force in Northern Irish politics coming up. And I don't know, I'm not an expert enough to tell you whether that's where that vote is coming from. But if it is a kind of breakdown in that divide between Unionist and Republican, Catholic and Protestant divide in Northern Irish politics, then that's probably a healthy thing in the long term. And I suspect you will begin to see that unravel over time, whether it will go to the Alliance or whether it will be more kind of left-right politics in thing. And there are, of course, left-right dimensions in Northern Ireland politics. It's not just sectarian. It's not just about republicanism or unionism. But you're seeing it in Ireland itself as well. The breakdown of the two-party system there, and Sinn Féin is completely, way ahead in the polls in the Republic. I think it's a very delicate balance, but I don't feel it's there's necessarily a huge risk of it going backwards, because I think there is a generation both within the major Republican parties, certainly, that there has been a generational change, and there are very different experiences.
It's interesting you say that. I was talking to a Northern Irish friend of mine who is active in the DUP, and said it's my generation that have got to take this forward. We've got to get rid of this sort of sectarian rubbish from the past.
Still at the top of the DUP.
Old guard are still controlling them. I mean, less so, I think, in Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland. But when I hear Mary Lou McDonald speaking sometimes, her tone is markedly different from Michelle O'Neill, isn't it? Which I don't know what inference to draw from that. Ella?
I think that I think that the question is probably a little bit harsh to define this purely as chaos in Northern Ireland. They've just had a historic shift in their electoral outcome, and power sharing and coalitions and other forms of government feel quite foreign to us, I think, here in London, certainly. But these things do take time. They are messier. They are more complex. And in some ways, it's designed to be that way. It's designed not to be so that one side can just make a decision without respect to the other community. I think you're right. I think that Sinn Féin under Michelle O'Neill is no longer just a single issue party. I think lots of people vote for Sinn Féin because they like their policies, in the same way that lots of people vote for the SNP who oppose independence, but because they like their policies. And I think that that's encouraging. I think it's really important that the union stays at the top of the agenda, though. I think, Nick and I will agree on this, that the union is one of the most precious and important things that we have going. And just because it is a little bit more complicated and messy doesn't mean that we should write it off as chaos and that everything's doomed. I do, however, think that the protocol needs some urgent examination and attention. I think that the status quo is clearly not sustainable. It cannot be the case that so many goods are no longer available in Northern Ireland. And I really, really do hope that that the EU also comes to the table on this, because it could be worked out. There's no need for them to be so stubborn about it. It's something that this is entirely resolvable if there is the willpower from the EU.
Right, well, let's take a final question from Dave in Liverpool, who says, so Ncuti Gatwa has been chosen as the 14th Doctor in Doctor Who. Who would have been your choice for the part? Brackets, ideally from the world of politics. Close brackets. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this actor, but he's been in Sex Education, which is where I've seen him on Netflix. And apparently he's 29 and he was playing like a 16-year-old, which takes a certain degree of talent, I think. Ben, let's come to you first.
Neil Parish. He's got lots of time on his hands and he's not great at technology.
I was wondering where you were going to go with that. Not many tractors in Doctor Who, are there? Nick?
Am I allowed to have one of my biographical subjects back from the past as a time? Can I have an Iron Bevan back from the past?
I think he would wear a great scarf, wouldn't he, Iron Bevan? Right. Ella?
Dr. Luke Evans. I think he's probably the most popular doctor in the Conservative Party. I think he'd do a good job and probably attract some more viewers.
He's the MP for somewhere in Leicestershire, isn't he?
Yes, and I'm sure he would have a large female following newly attracted to Doctor Who.
How shallow. Andrew?
I'm not really a big fan of Doctor Who, so I don't particularly like it. I might watch it now. I did like Sex Education. I think he's a great actor, but I'm trying to think who's quite technical, who's quite into technology and science fiction. I mean, maybe Chiomura is...
Dominic Cummings?
Would be a good...
Actually...
He's very into technology.
No, I could see him doing Doctor
There you go.
Who.
Yeah, maybe her.
He needs a job.
Very on top of science and technology within the Labour Party anyway, so...
Can I just recommend, apropos of absolutely nothing at all, on Netflix, a series called Heartstopper.
Oh, brilliant.
It is amazing, isn't it?
Did you cry?
I did many times. It's a really uplifting sort of gay coming out story. There's no sex in it, there's no violence, there's no swearing, there's no booze, there's no drugs. It is just a lovely story. So anybody that sort of wants a bit of a weep, go and watch that. Thank you to all of our panel, Nick Thomas-Symonds, Ben Kentish, Ella Robertson, McKay and Andrew Fisher. We'll have another cross question for you tomorrow at the same time. But in a moment, we're going to be asking you what's going on in Northern Ireland. What are the consequences of the results from Thursday's elections in Northern Ireland? The DUP say they won't nominate a Deputy First Minister unless Brandon Lewis does something about the Northern Ireland Protocol. I'd love to hear from you if you are from Northern Ireland or the Republic, and indeed the rest of the United Kingdom. 0345 6060 973. I'm not indicating that the Republic is part of the United Kingdom before anyone sends in a text. 1 minute past 9.